Hurricane Ike wasn't the strongest storm on record, but it was massive, unpredictable, and devastating.
I was on the ground, experiencing Ike as it tore through the Texas coast.
I was in the studio tracking every frame, while my family wrote it out at a home in Houston.
The scale, the impact, the human cost, that storm left a mark.
And after Ike, we started talking more about storm surge, uncertainty, the full scope of risk. This is our story of Hurricane Ike.
Of Hurricane Ike.
And what it taught us. Last time we were talking about the buildup to Hurricane Ike making landfall, and it was our first time going through hurricanes right in the heart of it.
Yeah.
But now we're going to talk about the actual day of the storm, and you started off with an early morning.
Yeah, no, early morning. It was an interesting morning. I woke up, of course, we're in Galveston, right? So we have all the Houston stations. My alarm went off. I didn't set it, but the alarm went off. And the first thing I heard was the sports people, you know, the local sports station out of Houston talking about the hurricane. And it kind of jolted me into reality, because here I am, you know, basically on a hotel on the seawall in Galveston. And, you know, when you hear the sports people talking about hurricanes and such, you know it's a big deal.
And at that point, I'd been on the air for 24 hours already, maybe 48 hours by that time.
Yeah.
And honestly, what we were telling people on Galveston Island, get off the island, that this was literally a life dangerous kind of a situation, and that people would not survive if they stayed, because we could start to see the setup. And unfortunately, there were a lot of people on the island that decided not to evacuate because Hurricane Rita had gone 40 miles eastward, and nothing had happened to them the time before. And we were trying to tell people, don't do that.
Unfortunately, Rita may have set a bad precedent. The fact that it did kind of veer away at the last minute. And I do remember the folks warning, say, get off Galveston Island.
And unfortunately, for some people, it did turn out that way. Now, as the storm made landfall, it was later in Friday night and early Saturday morning on the 13th of September is when it really made landfall. But it came in, the storm surge came in 12 hours before the storm because it was such a gigantic storm.
And I do remember lots of media out there, and I remember getting into the afternoon hours and watching that surge just come in and being like, my goodness, if this is happening now, and we're still, 12 hours away from landfall, this could be a problem. Now, we were on the seawall. It's funny, actually, we were right by where that statue is, that famous statue that's dedicated to the victims of the 1900 hurricane. We were right by that. And so the seawall where we were seemed fairly solid. You know, I think that that is obviously a very tall seawall to protect from extreme storm surges. So we had that going for us. But as the day progressed, I was getting a little nervous. You know, there were still people out in the wall, on the seawall, some out in the jetties, you know, and the piers. And I just remember, like, we got to get shelter. Like, we got to get to our hotel. And it was my first time, so I was nervous.
Well, and unfortunately, the Bolivar Peninsula is right next to, it's just to the north of Galveston, and the only way you can get on it is either a ferry, and there's one bridge. And since the storm surge came in early, all the people who had not evacuated were now stuck on Bolivar Island. And by the afternoon, winds were already at 40, 45 miles per hour, so first responders were done, and we had hundreds and hundreds of people stuck either on Galveston, but definitely on the Bolivar Peninsula. They could not get off.
And the Bolivar Peninsula didn't have that seawall, if I recall.
Nope, there is nothing.
They were much more exposed to that storm surge.
So the storm came in, and we ended up having a storm surge at 20 to 25 feet in some places, which is just devastating, especially now the seawall protected you, did exactly what it was supposed to do, but there were a lot of people that were stuck, and so that's what we dealt with that night.
Right, and it just kind of, it gets me, gives you shivers almost thinking about the situation. And thinking about what was happening where I was and how scared I was. The fear that I had eventually transitioned from that surge to more of just the winds. Now, this thing made landfall as a Category 2, if I recall. It wasn't even a major hurricane, but the winds were so intense. And I just remember thinking, like, my goodness, if this is a Category 2 hurricane, like, what it must be like for some of the stronger hurricanes. And I can also think now what those what those folks must have been dealing with out on that peninsula there, as all that impact came in with those winds and the surge. I mean, how scary!
I literally had somebody call me who was on the Bolivar Peninsula who had not evacuated. I don't know how they got into me, but literally the water was coming into their house as they were talking to me, and I could hear their wife screaming in the background. And unfortunately, neither one of them survived that I had spoken to. And so there were terrifying moments that night. I will never forget. Now, for my family, it ended up being fine. They were in the right place, doing the right thing. So they basically had kind of a little hurricane party because they were safe, and they all went to sleep. But as we would find out, which we're going to talk about in our next segment, is once we got up Saturday morning, we really saw how devastating Ike was. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next segment.